The bishop had already left our farmhouse when my father told me. I was kneading bread at the kitchen counter, flour up to my elbows, and he said it the way you'd announce the weather. Eli Stoltzfus would be a good husband. The wedding would be in November. I was 17 years old, and I had spoken to Eli exactly 4 times in my entire life. The dough went sticky under my hands because I had stopped moving. My mother didn't look up from the stove. My younger sister Rebecca froze with a jar of preserves halfway to the shelf. And I stood there with flour on my dress listening to the clock on the wall, realizing that the rest of my life had just been decided in a conversation I wasn't even invited to. Before I tell you what I did on my wedding night, the thing I have never told anyone, not my therapist, not the few English friends who know my story, not even the man who eventually became my real husband years later, I need you to understand who I am. My name is Hannah, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I share the stories we were never allowed to speak out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and everything I'm about to tell you happened in a farmhouse less than 40 miles from where you might have driven through on vacation, smiling at the buggies, never knowing what was happening behind those plain white walls. If this kind of truth matters to you, please hit that subscribe button, tap the like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let me pull back the curtain on something outsiders almost never understand correctly about how marriages actually form in the stricter church districts. Ask anyone in my community and they'll insist, truthfully in many cases, that nobody arranges our marriages the way people picture it in old movies. There are singeings on Sunday nights. There are long buggy rides home in the dark. There's a slow, patient kind of courting that I've walked through in earlier videos, and for a lot of couples that really is the whole story. But underneath that official version runs a second, quieter current that no tour guide will ever mention to the tourists snapping photos of our clotheslines. It surfaces when a household has raised too many daughters and not enough acres to divide among sons. It surfaces over a kitchen table when a bishop almost offhandedly mentions to 2 families that a particular pairing would serve everyone well. It surfaces when a young man with a good name in the church expresses interest in a girl, and her father answers yes before she has even heard the question asked. Nobody signs a contract. No money changes hands on paper. But once the fathers nod, once the bishop gives his quiet blessing, once the whole community starts speaking of the match as settled fact, a girl's say in the matter becomes something close to theater. Yes, you can refuse. Nobody will drag you to the altar. But refusing means humiliating your father in front of the church. It means becoming the daughter who decided she knew better than her parents and her bishop combined. And when your housing, your food, your friendships, and your standing before God are all tied to staying inside that community's good graces, that kind of refusal stops being a real option and starts being closer to self-destruction. Eli was 24. His uncle, a man with no sons of his own, had a 90-acre farm waiting for whoever would take it, and that farm needed a wife attached to it, someone to run the household, bear the children, and feed the crews during harvest. According to my father, what I needed was a steady man with land and a future in front of him. Nobody in that conversation mentioned that I had wanted more time. Nobody mentioned that I had spent fellowship meals laughing with a boy from the next district named Samuel, or that I had quietly hoped something might grow there eventually. None of that got a seat at the table. My father had already decided, my mother had already agreed, the bishop had already blessed it. And I, 17 years old with flour drying on my knuckles, was expected to receive all of it with gratitude. Stay with me, because what I actually did behind that closed bedroom door on my wedding night, once the lamp was lit and the house had gone quiet, is something I've kept locked away for a long time. I'm finally ready to open that door for you. The 4 months between that announcement and the ceremony blurred together, like I was watching footage of somebody else's life play out from a distance. I stitched my own wedding dress out of the traditional deep blue fabric, my hands moving on their own while my mind wandered somewhere far off. I spent afternoons helping my mother plan a meal that would eventually feed 280 guests. Twice. I sat in our front room across from Eli while our parents sipped coffee and made conversation about cattle prices, the weather, and the new addition his uncle was putting on the Dottie house. I want to be honest about something first. Eli was never unkind to me. Not once. He was a serious, quiet young man with hands weathered by sun and careful, watchful eyes, and when he looked at me, I could tell he genuinely wanted this to work. He'd ask about the vegetables I was growing that season. He'd ask which hymns I liked singing most. He was doing exactly what was expected of him, playing his role faithfully. The problem was never Eli as a person. The problem was that he was still, in every way that mattered, a stranger to me. And when I tried to picture the next 60 years of my life unfolding beside him, raising his children, keeping his house, growing old inside a kitchen he had built with his own hands, My chest would clamp shut until I physically could not breathe. The real problem underneath all of it was that nobody had ever once asked me what I wanted. During our short courtship, we went through bundling exactly twice, both times inside my parents' house, both times fully dressed, both times so quiet and rigid that we might as well have been two commuters waiting silently for a delayed train. He held my hand a single time. I let him. My own hand felt foreign to me, like it belonged to someone I hadn't met yet. If any part of this is landing somewhere tender for you right now, if you're recognizing pieces of your own story or a friend's story inside mine, take 1 second and hit like, hit subscribe. It tells the algorithm to put these stories in front of other women who need them, and that reach matters more than you'd think. Now let me walk you through the wedding day itself, because this is where the truth starts to come into sharper focus. I woke at 4 a.m. and was sick into the chamber pot beside my bed. My mother heard me through the wall and came in with a cool damp cloth. She pressed it to my forehead and told me gently that every bride feels this way, that it would pass. She meant every word of it kindly, she did. But looking up at her by the light of that single candle, I understood something clearly for the first time. She had no idea what I was actually carrying, because in our world, there was no vocabulary for what I was feeling. There was no accepted phrase for I do not want this. There was only obedience, or there was disgrace, and nothing existed in between those two. The ceremony stretched on for 3.5 hours. The bishop built his sermon around a wife's duties as laid out in Ephesians. I sat on that unforgiving wooden bench in my new blue dress, hands folded in my lap, and I spoke my vows in front of God and 280 witnesses. And my voice never wavered because by then I had already learned how to make my voice perform exactly what the moment demanded, while the real me retreated somewhere behind my own eyes to watch it happen from a safe distance. The meal came and went. The visiting came and went. The long afternoon of singing came and went. Guests lingered late into the evening. My new mother-in-law pulled me into a hug and called me daughter. My father shook Eli's hand for what felt like a very long time, and then, slowly the sun went down behind the barn. Because in our tradition the bride doesn't leave for her new home the same night, relatives who had traveled from out of state began claiming the upstairs bedrooms of my parents' house for the evening. We would stay another full day before beginning weeks of visiting extended family, and only after all of that would we finally move to Eli's farm. So when the two of us climbed the narrow staircase toward the small bedroom my mother had prepared, the house around us was packed with people. My grandmother slept in the room directly across the hallway. 2 of Eli's cousins had claimed the room right below ours. The walls in that house were paper thin. Every floorboard announced itself. Privacy, on an Amish wedding night, is close to a punchline. Eli shut the door behind the two of us. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, trembling circle of light across the wooden floor. He shrugged off his black coat and hung it with care over the back of a chair. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, still fully dressed in my wedding gown, and I felt the entire weight of 17 years pressing down against my ribs like a hand. He sat beside me. The old bed frame groaned under us. Somewhere down below, a man's laughter drifted up through the floorboards. Eli reached over and took my hand. His palm warm, slightly rough with calluses, and he asked me quietly, "Hannah, are you all right?" And this is the part where the story turns. This is the part I've carried alone for years, and I'm finally going to say it out loud. I broke down crying. Not the gentle, acceptable kind of crying a bride is permitted on her wedding night. The kind older women whisper about as tears of overwhelmed gratitude. This was something older and deeper than that. Something that didn't stop no matter how hard I pressed my hands against my own face. I cried until I couldn't pull in a full breath. And Eli, this careful, quiet young man I had married a little over 3 hours earlier, didn't flinch away from it. He didn't grow frustrated. He didn't ask me to compose myself. He simply stayed there beside me on that creaking bed in that lamplit room, and he waited me out. When I finally found words, I said the first fully honest sentence I had spoken in 4 months. I said it in Pennsylvania Dutch, because that was the only language my grief actually knew how to speak. I told him I did not want this. I did not want to marry you. I did not want to marry anyone yet. Nobody asked me, and then I braced myself, waiting for his anger, waiting for him to march downstairs and repeat every word to my father, waiting for whatever consequence I had spent 4 months, quietly dreading. If this story is stirring something in you right now, if you're a woman finally hearing another woman say out loud what she couldn't say herself at 17, please subscribe to this channel and turn that notification bell on. There's so much more waiting to be told, and I need you here for it. What Eli did next is the entire reason I'm able to sit here and tell you this story today. He went quiet for a long stretch. The lamp flickered against the wall. The old house settled and creaked around us. And then, very softly, he said, "I know. He said it a second time. I know, Hannah, nobody asked me either. I turned and looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since that kitchen table announcement 4 months earlier, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected to find there. He looked exhausted. He looked frightened. He was 24 years old, handed a farm by an uncle who needed an heir, and told, in essence, that a wife was simply part of the arrangement. He'd said yes to marrying me because our two sets of parents had already decided we were suitable for each other. What I hadn't known was that he'd spent nearly 2 years hoping to court a girl from his own district named Mary, only to watch her family match her with someone else first. His uncle was aging. The farm needed a wife by spring. And so he had done, quietly and dutifully, exactly what was expected of him. He told me all of this in a low, steady voice while distant laughter kept drifting up from the rooms below us. He admitted he'd cried alone out in the barn the week our engagement was first announced. He admitted he had no real idea how to be a husband to a woman he barely knew. He told me he had hoped, against his better judgment, that I might feel differently than I clearly did, but that watching my face throughout the ceremony that afternoon had told him everything he needed to know. And so, on my wedding night in that small lamplit room, while 280 guests slept somewhere around us in a house thick with the smell of coffee, wood smoke, and the long day just behind us, here's what actually happened between us. We talked, that was the entirety of it. We kept talking until the lamp finally burned down low. We talked about the people we'd each secretly hoped to marry instead. We talked about our fears, his fear that he might never come to love me, mine that I might never learn to love anyone after all this. We talked about the farm waiting for us, the children that would eventually be expected of us, the long years stretching out ahead like an unmarked road. And somewhere in the middle of all that talking, we struck a quiet agreement, the kind no bishop would ever have sanctioned and no parent would ever have understood. We agreed we would not be intimate that night. We agreed we would lie down side by side beneath the quilt my grandmother had stitched by hand, still fully clothed, with a careful stretch of space between our two bodies. We agreed we would try slowly and honestly to build a friendship first, and that if something deeper eventually grew out of that friendship, we would let it arrive in its own time, at its own pace, on our own terms. We agreed the rest of the community never needed to know any of this. We agreed that whatever happened behind that closed bedroom door belonged only to the two of us. I stayed awake for most of that night, listening to him breathe beside me, aware of how strange it felt to have an unfamiliar body sharing my bed. A body I had just promised the rest of my life to without ever really knowing it. I thought about my mother, asleep somewhere else in that same crowded house, and her whispered words, "It will pass." I thought about the girl I had been 4 months earlier, elbow dip in bread dough, and the woman I had somehow already become, married now, lying next to a stranger who, it turned out, had also been pushed into a life he never chose for himself. And underneath all of it, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that night. Not love. It was far too soon for anything close to love. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the very first thread of trust. The realization that maybe I wasn't quite as alone in that bed as I'd believed just a few hours earlier. If this is the kind of honesty you've been waiting to hear, take 1 second and subscribe. And turn that notification bell on so the next story reaches you the moment it's ready. The algorithm rewards videos that women actually stay with until the end. And you finishing this one matters more than you'd guess. Let me tell you what happened after that night, because this is the part that seems to surprise people most whenever I share it. Ellie and I stayed married for almost 6 years before I eventually left the community altogether. And across those 6 years something took root between the two of us that I still struggle to name precisely, even now. It wasn't the sweeping dramatic love described in the hymns, and it wasn't the kind of consuming romantic passion I'd later encounter reading English novels after I left. But it was real, unmistakably real. We became genuine friends, we became true partners to each other. He learned that I needed an uninterrupted hour alone in the garden every single morning just to feel like myself again. I learned that he lived with a quiet fear of his uncle's temper, and that he was still grieving, in his own private way, the girl he hadn't been permitted to marry. In the evenings, once the lamps were lit, we talked openly about things our own parents had never once discussed with each other in 40 years of marriage. Intimacy did eventually come between us, but only much later, only once it had grown naturally on its own timeline, on a particular night that felt like it belonged entirely to us, and not to the expectations of the community around us. My friend Rebecca, who married the same autumn I did, once confided in me while we stood canning peaches together in her kitchen, that she still couldn't stand the smell of her own husband's hair oil, even 4 years into their marriage. She said it plainly, almost casually, the way you'd mentioned that it looked like rain. I just held her hand for a long moment and didn't say anything at all. She never got an Eli. Most girls in our world never did. Even back then, I understood clearly that what I had accidentally stumbled into was rare, and that the system responsible for placing me in that bedroom had done absolutely nothing to earn it. When I finally left the community at 23, it was Eli who drove me to the bus station in the dark before sunrise. He'd known for the better part of a year that I needed to go. We'd talked through it together, in our bed, in that same careful, unhurried way we'd first learned to talk to each other on our wedding night all those years earlier. He cried when he pulled me into a final hug at the station. I cried too. The shunning that followed afterward, the letters that went unanswered, the doors that quietly closed to me among my own parents and siblings. I've spoken about all of that in other videos already. But Eli, in his own restrained, quiet way, never fully cut me off the way the rest of the community expected him to. Twice a year, without fail, a card would arrive with no return address, just my name written across the front in his careful, familiar handwriting. Nothing else inside, just my name. He passed away 3 years ago in a farming accident. I found out through an English neighbor of his who managed to track down my phone number. I grieved for a full week afterward, not because I had ever been in love with him the way English people typically mean that word, but because he had been the one person in that entire world who ever genuinely asked me how I truly felt, and then actually waited long enough to hear the real answer. Later, in therapy, I came across a term I'd never encountered before: coercive consent. It describes consent that is technically given on the surface, but that can't be meaningfully refused, because the price of refusing it is losing everything. What I gave at 17 was coercive consent. The vows I spoke in front of those 280 witnesses were coercive. The bed I was placed in that night was the product of coercion dressed up as tradition. None of it would have survived a single honest question asked out loud. And yet every piece of it was treated by my community as nothing less than the will of God. What Eli and I quietly built together afterward, the friendship, the private agreement, the slow and careful trust we constructed brick by brick, that part was genuinely ours. We built it out of nothing, with no map to follow and no one's permission granted. The system never handed us that. We took it for ourselves in whispers, inside a lamplit room, while the rest of the house slept on around us, completely unaware. If you grew up somewhere your future got decided in a conversation you were never invited to attend, I see you. If you ever stood in a kitchen with flour drying on your hands while the rest of your life was being arranged in another room down the hall, I see you. If you ever lay beside someone you'd promised your entire life to, wondering whether anyone would ever bother asking how you truly felt about any of it, I see you too. You weren't weak for crying that night. You weren't lacking in faith for wanting something more than what was handed to you. You were a young person asked to shoulder a weight that was never meant for someone your age, and simply carrying it at all was its own quiet form of strength. I can't give you back the years that were taken from either of us. I can't undo decisions that were made on our behalf before we were ever consulted. But I can tell you this much: that small voice inside you that once whispered, "I did not want this," was never a sin. That voice was the single most honest thing in the entire room. Listen to it now, even if circumstances never allowed you to listen to it back then. If this story reached something in you, tell me in the comments which part stayed with you afterward. Share your own story if you feel ready to, or simply let me know you're out there listening. And if you want more honest truths from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl, like this video, and turn on that notification bell, because there is so much more I still haven't said. Until next time, remember this: the life that was chosen for you was never the only life you were ever allowed to want. Choose your freedom carefully. It might be the thing that ends up saving you.